Okay. Okay, I have just after 11 o'clock, so I guess we'll get started. Good morning. Welcome to National Archives. I'm glad the rain didn't keep everybody away. I was a little worried about that when I came in this morning. It was pouring buckets. So this morning's talk is part of our Beyond the Basics lecture series, where we take some basic records that we generally deal with in our Introduction to Genealogy lecture that we give every month, and then we go into a little more detail, a little more background. I'm John Deben. I'm one of the genealogy specialists in the Research Support Branch here in Archives 1. So I guess we'll get started. We're going to talk about, give an overview of Army service in both the Confederate and Union forces during the Civil War. One of the things that I want to point out first, I'm going to maybe turn the lights down maybe a little bit further. Is that okay for the camera back there? Okay. And we'll leave it on. Can everybody see the screen okay? I wanted to point out the two major record groups that we're going to be dealing with. All of the records that relate to soldiers in the Civil War are going to come out of two basic record groups. Record Group 94 for Union soldiers, which are the records of the Adjutant General's office. The Adjutant General of the U.S. Army was basically the chief record keeper of the Army at that time. So all of the records relating to the service of these soldiers eventually came to his office. And then for Confederate soldiers, the main record group that we're dealing with is Record Group 109, the War Department collection of Confederate records. These are basically the records that survived the war, whether they were captured or surrendered during the course of the war at the end. Then they were turned over to the War Department by the U.S. Army, and the War Department organized them. They actually had a division within the War Department called the Rebel Archives, and they put these records there, arranged them for publication. So that arrangement is still how the records are used today. There are basically two types of service that we're going to be talking about that pertain to the Civil War. The first type of service are the volunteer soldiers. This is what has always been characteristic of the United States Army, the American Army. The citizen soldiers, these are the men who were called up for service during a war or a time of national crisis. They were enlisted, recruited, and they fought during the course of the war, and then at the end of the war, their units were disbanded and they went home. That's basically what distinguishes their service from the regular Army. And the War Department documented their services in specific ways. The basic type of record that we have for volunteer soldiers during the Civil War are the compiled military service records. And the thing to know about these records basically is that they're not contemporary to the war itself. Okay? These records were created by the War Department decades later in the 1890s. And the basic premise was that they wanted to create a consolidated source of information to document the veterans' service during the war to facilitate the pension application process for pensions for these soldiers. So they created these compiled service records. What they did was they created a series of cards, and then they looked at all of the available records from the war itself that still existed, the muster rolls, regimental book records, all these things we're going to be talking about in a little bit. And they would comb through these records, and every piece of information that related to an individual soldier they would record on a card. And that card was stamped with the soldier's unit, his company, and every specific piece of information was recorded on that card. And this is how they created the compiled service record for every individual soldier. As I said, they started doing this for Union soldiers for the war. The idea, I guess, became so popular that they eventually went back and started creating these compiled service records for other wars as well. So now what we have today here at the archives are compiled service records for volunteer soldiers from the Revolutionary War all the way up to the Philippine Insurrection, which ended in 1902. So any volunteer soldier who served in a specific war during that whole time frame will have a compiled service record for that individual. The compiled service records for Union soldiers, as I said, they're in Record Group 94. This is the basic series that the records are located in, entry 519 in RG 94. These are the carded records of volunteer organizations for the Civil War. And again, these are just the Union ones. They're arranged generally by state and then by arm of service, whether it's infantry, cavalry, or artillery, then by the numerical designation of the unit, and then the individual cards and the jackets are arranged alphabetically by the soldier's name within the unit itself. We have compiled service records for every major northern state that contributed troops to the Civil War, but these are only available in textual form currently. What we do have available on microfilm records for Union soldiers are those soldiers that were raised in the border states, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and sometimes Delaware is also considered a border state because it was a slave state during the war. Also, the District of Columbia is considered on the border. So these are available on microfilm, and also Union soldiers that were raised from the western states and territories, California, Territory of New Mexico, things like that. And also we have compiled service records for Union soldiers who were raised from the southern states. And most people don't realize this, but we do have records of Union soldiers who served from every major southern state except South Carolina during the war. And of course, these regiments were not raised by the state governments in the South, obviously, but they were recruited by the Union Army as it moved down through the territory and reoccupied different states. They did their own recruiting, so they did raise at least a handful of regiments from every state throughout the South except South Carolina. And so those compiled service records are also available on microfilm. And if you look at the green handouts that you got, the one on the top that says the microfilm compiled service records, this will give you the microfilm publication number for all of the indexes and for all of the individual publications for every state, for both Union and Confederate compiled service records. So you want to keep that handy as you're doing your research. And there are separate indexes for each state as well, for the Northern or the Union service records. This is a typical example of what a compiled service record looked like, just in case you haven't seen one before. The first image here, this is the jacket that the records are kept in. And the basic information that the jacket will always show you is the soldier's name at the top. It will give his unit and his company designation, and it will show the rank he held when he went into service and the rank he held when he came out of service. So in this case, this is the service record for John W. McLean, who was the colonel of the 83rd Pennsylvania. That's why the company up here is designated as FNS, which stands for Field and Staff. Then the two cards here, these are just two examples of the cards that are located in the jacket. These show specific information that was gleaned from two different records pertaining to John McLean during the war. The middle one shows information taken from a Field and Staff muster roll from May and June of 1862. And the third card over here shows the muster out roll for the regiment that was taken on September 20th, 1864, when the regiment was mustered out of service just before it was re-enlisted as a veteran volunteer regiment. Both of those muster rolls show that John W. McLean was actually killed at the Battle of Gaines' Mill during the Peninsula Campaign in 1862. The reason he shows up on the 1864 muster roll is because this is a muster out roll. It includes a complete listing of every individual who's associated with that regiment during the course of its existence. So even though he died 2 years previously, he was listed as the first colonel of the regiment there. And you also notice there can be some discrepancies in the records. You'll see that this record notes the battle as the Battle of Chickahominy, where this one notes it as the Battle of Gaines' Mill. Most people generally know the battle as the Battle of Gaines' Mill during the Peninsula Campaign, but sometimes you can find just little idiosyncrasies like that throughout the records. Yes, sir.
I had a question about the last slide. You said
Sure.
these were created during the 1890s, these cards.
Beginning in the 1890s.
What did they use? What was the source documents they used for?
Like I said, they used the available muster rolls that were kept during the war. They used regimental book records, which we'll talk about in a little bit. They gleaned through hospital records that were kept at the time,
Those as well.
prisoner of war records. Yep, we have all those.
Everything they used to create
Yes, everything that they used to create these compiled service records, we have in this building. Okay, in addition to the state regiments that were raised during the war, the volunteers, there were also a variety of what they called U.S. volunteer regiments, raised directly by the federal government, not associated with any one particular state. They were recruited across state lines. The most famous of those, of course, are the U.S. colored troops. Originally recruited in 1863 as a handful of state regiments, the most famous of which was the 54th Massachusetts. And then they took on the USCT designation. But we have the compiled military service records for the USCT troops. These are in the process of being microfilmed. There are, at least for the infantry regiments, there are some 138 regiments that were recruited during the war. And so far they're only partially microfilmed. But what we currently have available on microfilm, in addition to the index to all the service records, which are available in publication M589, we have all the cavalry units on microfilm in publication M1817, all of the artillery units in M1818, and then we currently have the 1st through the 55th USCT infantry on microfilm. And each individual publication is listed again on the green handout to show you which publication has which regiments. And then we also have the 55th and the 54th Massachusetts are reproduced on their own microfilm publications as well, in M1898 and M1801. Other U.S. volunteer regiments that were also raised. There's one general index that covers all of the different types of units and organizations, which is M1290. But the actual service records for these units are not microfilmed, so they're only available in textual form. But you see from the list here, it's a pretty eclectic group. Some of these you probably have come across before. Most people are familiar with the U.S. sharpshooters. These are generally known as Berdan sharpshooters. These are the guys in the green uniforms that most people are generally familiar with. The Signal Corps, Pioneer Corps, Indian Home Guards. These two on the bottom here, the Mississippi Marine Brigade and the Mississippi Flotilla, even though these sound like they should be naval units, they're actually not. These were Army units that were recruited to serve on the river in conjunction with the Navy, but they're actually Army units. So we have compiled service records for individuals who served in all of these types of organizations as well. And in addition, we also have compiled service records for the galvanized Yankees, which were formerly known as the 1st through the 6th U.S. Volunteer Regiments. These were the captured Confederates who volunteered to serve in the Union Army during the war, and rather than send them back into the field to fight against their former comrades, the galvanized Yankees were sent out west to fight the Indians in 1864 and 1865. These again are, their service records are covered in M1290, but the galvanized Yankees, their specific service records are available on microfilm. They have been filmed in publication M1017. And we also have records relating to individuals who were assigned to the Veteran Reserve Corps. This was originally referred to as the Invalid Corps. These were the men who were slightly wounded, but they were not so disabled that they couldn't provide some type of service. So they were enlisted into the Veteran Reserve Corps, and mostly they did like general garrison duty. They didn't do active combat fighting, mostly fort and garrison duty. We have a microfilm publication for that indexes those records in M636, but again, the compiled service records for the VRC are only available in textual form. Okay, and then in addition to the Union, we also have compiled service records for the Confederate soldiers. These records were created again by the War Department starting in 1903, and for the next 24 years, they worked to create these compiled service records for the Confederates as well. And these are available in Record Group 109 in the series Carded Records Showing Military Service, Entry 193. They're arranged identically to the Union compiled service records by state, then by type of service, then by unit, and then alphabetically by soldier's name. The difference here is that all of the Confederate service records have currently been microfilmed, so everything is available in film. And again, the individual publications are listed on the green handout. There are also separate state indexes for each southern state that supplied Confederate soldiers, as well as a consolidated index for the whole, that covers pretty much everything. And again, those are all listed on the green handout as well. In addition to the microfilm indexes that we have available, I wanted to mention two different indexes that are available online, because these can also be useful. The first is, you might have already heard of it at some point before. This is the Civil War Soldiers and Sailors system that was created by the National Park Service. It's actually based pretty much on the microfilmed indexes that we have here. But it contains over 6 million names, and not only does it provide the basic unit information for each soldier, but it does give unit histories and battle summaries as well that you can click on and get more information. And then if you go to Ancestry.com, they have two specific databases that you can search to find service information in their U.S. Civil War collection. The first database is the American Civil War Soldiers, and this is a database that's based on published soldier rosters that were compiled at various times by different states. And then the U.S. Civil War Soldiers database, which is actually based on the Soldiers and Sailors system itself. And then the only place that I currently know of that you can look for actual digitized images of some of the compiled service records are on Footnote, footnote.com. The thing to keep in mind, though, is they currently only have scanned images of only of the microfilmed publications. So all of the compiled service records that have not been reproduced on microfilm so far, that are only available in textual form, are currently not available yet on Footnote. So again, to reiterate, that what you can find are all the Confederate records, the selected Union ones for the border states, the western states and territories, and the southern states, and the USCT. With one exception, they only have the publications running up through the 46th Infantry. So the most recent publication that just came out within the last year or so, that goes up to the 55th USCT, that's not currently on Footnote yet. Most of the scans for the Confederate records are pretty much complete, between 99 and 100% complete, but the Union and the USCT scans are still in various states of completion. If you go on and click on the actual records and look at the different data sets, you'll see percentages for how close or how far things have been scanned so far. And before we go on, I did want to show you, if you're interested in actually looking at these databases and see how they work, and the websites. So we'll do that for a couple minutes. Let me get out of here for a second. Okay. This is going to go to the look at the Soldiers and Sailors system first. And if you actually go to the Park Service's main webpage on www.nps.gov, I was not able to find a direct link to the Soldiers and Sailors system from the page, but if you go to the search box up on top and just put in CWSS for Civil War Soldiers and Sailors and do a search on that, it'll bring up the same link to get you to this page. So this is what the Soldiers and Sailors systems look like, and you can see here there are different links to search for soldiers, sailors. You can look up regiments, cemeteries, battles. Not all of these down here are fully complete yet, but the Soldiers and Sailors information are. And this is what the search page looks like. Does anybody have a specific name you'd like to search? Yeah. First name? Thomas? Okay. You said Stafford. Union or Confederate? Do you know what state he served? Okay. Gives you a list here. Okay, is it the same person or is it two different persons? Well, as you see, the search gives you two different options. And basically, when you click on the soldier's name, it gives you this information, which basically comes straight off of the service record jacket. So it'll show his unit, what site is on this. In this particular instance, it doesn't list what company he's in, but it shows that he was a private going in and coming out. And it'll also show you here which microfilm index the information was taken from. Okay, and those are the indexes that we have here that I mentioned before. If you go back and click on the unit information, this will give you an overview of the unit itself, the unit history, and then you can click on any of these highlighted engagements, and it'll give you an overview of the battle itself, give you some more information. Okay? One other thing that might be useful that I saw here at the very top here, at the front page of the system, we're here where it says Researcher's Toolbox. If you click on that, it gives you information on how you can request the records from the National Archives. It identifies the specific mail-in forms that we have available, the NATF forms. 85 is actually for pension records, but for service records you can use NATF form 86. And it gives you information how you can submit the request if you want to get an actual copy from the archives of the original service record. So that information is right there, available at the front of the system. Okay, let me show you a quick Ancestry. Actually, I want to go for Ancestry. I want to go through our subscription that we have. So I want to go. If you're in any archives facility, we have an institutional subscription to Ancestry, so you can use it for free. But you have to be in one of our buildings using one of our public access computers. But to get to it, you go to the genealogy section of the website, and then down here where it says within a National Archives facility, then you can click on the Ancestry link. And that'll take you to the Ancestry Institution subscription that we have. And then once you're in Ancestry, up here in the main search box, you want to select military. And then if you want to get to those specific databases that I mentioned, down in the middle of the page here, there's a listing of all the individual databases that are part of the U.S. Civil War collection. So here's the American Civil War soldiers. And again, this time we'll do my ancestor. I had a great-great-grandfather who was in the war. His name is David Hodge. And he was Union. And he served from Pennsylvania. And if you do, let's see. Okay. I happen to know, just from looking before, that my David Hodge that I'm looking for is the first one listed here. So if you can highlight where it says View Record, and it'll give you an overview of his information. Or you can click on the View Record, and then it'll show you again. Shows that he was enlisted as a corporal, his date of enlistment, and the date he was mustered out. And then you can search, if you want to, you can search more information on the other enlisted men who were in the company that he served with from these links. And then it gives the source information down here, where the information was taken from. Yes, ma'am? Oh yeah, they have thousands of different databases that they've compiled from other records that we have and other published records that are available.
Somebody who served in the Western Fort
Hmm.
in the 1870s or 1880s,
They
they might have something.
might have something, yeah. Hmm. And then if we go back, look at the other database here quickly. Down here on the bottom is the U.S. Oh, where's that? U.S. Civil War soldiers. And again, we'll do David Hodge again quick. And I know I already know that he was in the 6th Regiment. And here, again, it gives you pretty much the same information that you can find in the soldiers and sailors system. The company, his rank, and it gives you the microfilm index that the information was taken from, M554. Okay, and finally, I want to quickly show you Footnote, which you can find on there. Okay, if you go up here and select Civil War, this will give you all the different collections that they currently have available relating to the Civil War. So you can go down here and select either Confederate Soldier Service Records or Union Soldier Service Records. And then they're arranged by state. Again, I'll just take a quick look here. And up here is where I told you, it shows you the state of completion of the scanning. And this currently shows that the Maryland records, Union Service records, are currently 20% scanned. So they have they have a little ways to go. But then within each state, they're arranged by unit. And if you select a unit, then they're arranged alphabetically by soldier's name. And eventually it will take you to links to the actual images for the compiled service records. Okay, and then you can select an image. And then there's a service jacket that the compiled service record is located in. Okay, any questions about the websites before we go on? Yeah.
Is the archives doing any scanning, or is it just outside?
Well, we're working with several partnerships right now to do the scanning, and Footnote's one of them. One thing I didn't mention before, you see where all these numbers are. A lot of people look at these numbers and they think that they lead to more records, but that's not actually the case. This is just a record-keeping technique that the War Department employed. Each one of these numbers corresponds to a number that's stamped on the back of one of the cards that are inside this jacket. So it's just a means for the War Department clerks to make sure that the right cards stay in the right jacket, so they don't actually lead to other records. Yes, ma'am. On Footnote? Or? Okay. Should be able to find them on here. Oops. Oh, do you know what unit he was in? No. Oh, then this particular search is not going to be useful, because to get to the actual service record, then you need to already know. So let's go back to. Oops, I don't want to go there. Let's go back to Ancestry quick. Okay, what was the name again? And he served from Virginia. Okay. Looks like there are two Martin Ganders. Does Leakesville, Page County sound familiar at all? This one just shows that he was a sergeant in Company I, the 97th Militia, Virginia Militia, the first one. And the second one might be the same guy, because it says because it also references the 97th Militia, and then he went to Company C of the 39th 39th Battalion Virginia Cavalry. Well, we might have something on him, but it might be somewhere else that we're going to get to in a couple minutes. Okay. In addition to the compiled service records, we also have what are referred to as personal papers for the volunteer soldiers. Again, as the War Department was creating the compiled service records and going through all these original records, whenever they would come across an individual document that related to a specific soldier, they would file that document with that soldier's compiled service record. So in the compiled service records, you'll find different types of personal papers filed in there, including the original enlistment papers, like this example that's shown here. You can find inventory of effects if a soldier was killed or died during the war. The War Department usually filled out an inventory of his personal effects. Final statements of service are in there. If he was a casualty, sometimes the War Department filled out a casualty sheet. You might find those in there. Yes? Probably not naturalization, because that wouldn't have pertained specifically to his military service during the war itself. But if he was in a hospital, there might be a hospital record in there that was filled out, something of that nature. So all these you might find these filed with the compiled service records. Now this record, some of you might have already seen this before. This past spring, did any of you get to watch that TV show, Who Do You Think You Are? Anybody see that show? Did anybody remember seeing this document on that program? This is an inventory of effects for Private Robert Martindale. This was the great-great-grandfather of Matthew Broderick. When they did the episode on his ancestry, they featured this document from his compiled service record. So I thought it'd be neat to show it again. But anyway, this is what a particular inventory of effects would look like. It gives the information about his service. It shows that Robert Martindale, actually information about his death, shows that he died on the skirmish line in front of Atlanta during the Battle of Atlanta by reason of a musket ball through the head. In this particular instance, though, it doesn't show that, doesn't list any of his personal belongings that he had on him, which I find a little unusual. And even though he was out on the picket line in the skirmish, he would have still had his military accoutrements with him. So I would have thought that they would have listed that, but for whatever reason, the clerks didn't. But this is what the typical document would look like. We also have personal papers for Confederate soldiers. For obvious reasons, they're not as prevalent as they are for the Union, because not a lot of them didn't survive the war again. But we do have, if you come across a compiled service record, if they're not specifically filed there in the service records, we have another series called Unfiled Papers and Slips belonging to Confederate Compiled Service Records. And this is available on microfilm, publication M347. This was intended by the War Department to be kind of like a catch-all series because they ended up coming across documents that they didn't quite know what to do with. They either found a record that it didn't correlate to an established service record and they didn't have enough other corroborating information to create a service record for that individual. Or some of the records actually relate to civilian service in the Confederate Army, like Teamsters and things like that. So if you're going through looking at compiled service records and you don't find any personal papers, you might want to at least take a look here to see if something shows up. We also have record of events, what they call record of events or sometimes troop movements. As I said, this carded record system apparently became very popular within the War Department. So in addition to creating the compiled service records for individual soldiers, they created carded histories for the regiments as well. And they went about it the same way as they did for the service records. They went through all the existing records for a particular regiment, especially the muster rolls, and then they created a series of carded records that documented the activities for that individual regiment, month by month and company by company. So you can actually trace it on a month-by-month basis and what this company did, where that company was temporarily assigned, or if they were in specific skirmishes or things like that. These were originally, the record of events cards were originally filed along with the compiled service records for each regiment, but when the archives decided to microfilm them separately, then they were separated out into their own series. So these are available on microfilm. The Union carded record of events are in M594. And again, they're arranged similar to what the service records are for the soldiers, by state and then by type of unit. And then we also have a separate series for the Confederate record of events or troop movements in microfilm publication M861. But as I said, these are not as complete as they are for the Union because a lot of the regimental records didn't survive. But they are basically arranged the same way. And if you're familiar with the OR, the official records of the War of the Rebellion, this is the published records of the war that was produced by the War Department in the late 19th century. There was a supplement to that was published in the 90s, and these provide complete transcripts for both the Union and Confederate record of event cards. So you can find them in published form here in Janet Hewitt's supplement to the OR, or you can find them individually on the microfilm publications. Now, as I said before, the compiled service records were based on the original records that were kept during the war itself, and we have those records. Specifically, we do have the muster rolls available. The Union rolls are available in RG94 in entry 57. You can see the rolls for the Civil War are kind of consolidated with a bunch of other wars, so it's one huge series, but they are available. We also have medical records that you can look at. Again, these are carded medical records, exact same principle as for the service records, but they were specifically created to document medical information for the volunteer soldiers. So those are available in this series, carded medical records for volunteers for both the Mexican and the Civil Wars in entry 534. And this is an example of what the carded medical records look like. As I said, they're virtually identical to the compiled service records. This is for another one of my ancestors, Michael Jacobs. He's a great uncle. And the first two cards show that he spent some time in a military hospital convalescing. Up here it shows you he was in here for incipient, if I can pronounce it, incipient amaurosis. Anybody know what that is? Basically, I don't know what causes it, but it basically is temporary loss of eyesight. So he he developed blurred vision for whatever reason. Probably, you know, sleeping out at night on a damp ground or whatever. I don't know what causes it, but he spent some time in a military hospital convalescing for that. This card here shows that he was admitted on March 1st, 1863. And then on April 3rd, he was transferred to a general hospital. Both these hospitals are located in Philadelphia. He was transferred to a general hospital on April 3rd. So the middle card shows him being admitted to that general hospital on 16th and Filbert Streets in Philadelphia. And then he was finally returned to duty on April 23rd of 1863. The last card here shows when he was wounded in battle during the Battle of New Hope Church during the Atlanta campaign. So this information was taken from a list of casualties for the regiment and shows that he was wounded in the leg on May 25th, 1864. And then down here at the bottom I want to point out is a reference to the original record that information was taken from. And just to reinforce the point that these cards were, you know, created by referencing the original records, here's that original casualty list that the information was taken from. And you'll see here is where Michael Jacobs is listed, showing that he was wounded in the leg on May 25th at Dallas, Georgia. And on the reverse side up here, there's that list number that was referenced on the carded record, casualty list 8638. That's where they got that from. So, and these, I wasn't going to talk extensively about the casualty list, but these are also available in Record Group 94, and they're arranged by regiment. We also have muster rolls for the Confederate Army as well, in two different series, muster and pay rolls in entry 18, and a few miscellaneous rolls for detailed men in entry 19. They're arranged pretty much similarly to the Union ones, but again, they're not as prevalent in nature as the Union records. And then we also have the regimental book records that were created during the war. These are the records that the regiments kept while they were operating actively in the field. Okay, there are a lot of different types of regimental book records that were kept. There were morning reports, order books, things of that nature, but the ones we're mostly interested in are what they refer to as the descriptive books. And these are available for volunteer organizations in RG 94, entry 114, again arranged by state and then by type of service, infantry, cavalry, artillery, and then by unit. And here you can find specific information about the individuals who served in that regiment. Sometimes they'll have lists of officers, they'll have lists of dead and wounded for each company that were compiled during the war, and then they'll have individual descriptions of each member. This is the example from the 46th Pennsylvania. This was Michael Jacobs' unit, but I'm actually showing you a different person here. We're going to take a look at number 76 here, Amos Wenrick. A typical entry in a descriptive book will show you his age when he enlisted. He was 19. It'll give you a little bit of a physical description. It shows that he was 5'6". He had a ruddy complexion and brown eyes and sandy colored hair. He was originally from Dauphin County, Pennsylvania. He was a farmer by trade. And most of the entries cover 2 pages. So this is page 1. If you go to the next page, I show you the date that he enlisted, September 2nd, 1861, in Harrisburg. Give you the recruiting officer's name and his term of service, which was for 3 years. And then in the remarks section here, it'll give you any incidental information about the soldier. Yes, ma'am. Probably the regimental adjutant. As I mentioned before, the adjutant general was the chief record keeper of the Army, and each regiment had their own adjutant as well. Well, he was part of the regimental staff, so he wasn't. During combat, he would have been, with the regiment, but otherwise he was responsible for keeping the records while they were in camp. So and they carted the records around in the regimental wagons as well. So they kept them in the field. So he made a notation here showing that Amos Wenrick drowned in the lock at Dam Number 6 on the Potomac River while on picket duty on the night of January 31st, 1862. Sometimes you find some little interesting tidbits of information because Wenrick must have made a kind of an impression on his comrades in the company, because the adjutant wrote here that he fell in the line of duty a mild, inoffensive boy, always ready and willing, intelligent and pious, in fact a model soldier. Long will his memory be cherished. So you don't usually find something like that, but it's nice when you do come across it in the records. Okay, so that basically covers information relating to service in the volunteer. The other component of that during the Civil War was service in the regular army. Of course, and this was the standing army that served during peacetime and during war. During the Civil War, at the beginning of the Civil War, the peacetime army was very small, about 16,000 men, but still it served to form the core of the Union forces during the war. Because these men were regular soldiers, their service was documented differently by the War Department. The War Department did maintain a series of registers of enlistment for the regular Army units and soldiers who were recruited into the regular Army. And these are, again, available in Record Group 94, Entry 89, and they're also available on microfilm, publication M233. And you can see it covers a huge time period. So you have to have some idea of when the soldier enlisted, because they're arranged by year of enlistment, and then generally by the first letter of the last name. So they're not completely alphabetical, but they're generally alphabetical, if you know what I mean. So all the names beginning with B are together, but they may not be arranged strictly alphabetically within there. But it will give you specific information about the soldier, including his name, his rank. Again, it'll give you a physical description. It will tell you his occupation in civilian life, his date and place of enlistment, his date and place of birth, and his enlistment and discharge information. So basically, it gives you the beginning of his service and the end of his service. Here's a typical example of what the register of enlistments look like. Again, each entry covers 2 pages. We'll take a specific look at this page, and we'll look at this soldier, Robert Allen. If you read through his entry, this is what you find out about him. He was 18 years old when he enlisted. On November 15th, 1862, he enlisted at Hilton Head, South Carolina. But he was originally from Massachusetts, from New Bedford. We find out that he is a paper maker. His physical description, he's blue eyes, brown hair, brown complexion, 5'3", and he was assigned to Company E to the 3rd U.S. Artillery. And in the remarks section, which generally tells you when he was discharged, it shows that he served until February 21st, 1865, and his reason for discharge was expiration of service, which took place at Wilmington, North Carolina. And he was a corporal at the time that he ended service. So again, it'll give you a basic overview of his service, when he went in and when he came out. We also have personal papers relating to regular soldiers, but because we do not have compiled service records for regular soldiers, these records are arranged separately, but they are available. So we have a specific series of enlistment papers for regular Army soldiers in Entry 91. We have other personal papers that are available during the Civil War period in Entry 94, again arranged by unit and then alphabetically by soldier. And again, it covers, aside from enlistment papers, that you'll find those inventory of effects. If somebody died during the service, you might find a report of death and interment. Those are also filled out by the War Department. This series, Final Statements, used to be part of the personal papers. It had been the intention of the War Department at one time to separate all the different personal papers out by type and arrange them separately in their separate series. And they got as far as the Final Statements, and then I guess they gave up on the project. So all the other types of personal papers are still arranged in a general series. But final statements are available in entry 96. And those records generally relate, they generally document the reason why a soldier left service, whether his enlistment expired, whether he died, or whatever. And I'll show you an example here in a second. Here's the original enlistment paper for Robert Allen, who we just looked at in the Register of Enlistments. So this is the original document upon which that entry was basically based. They took all of the information that you found in the register was taken from his original enlistment paper. This is the final statement of service for Private John Boyer of the 10th U.S. Infantry, Company B. And again, it gives all the basic information about him, where he was born, a physical description, his enlistment information, and then here in this column here, or this portion here, it shows his reason for discharge, which in this case, it shows that he died during service on October 19th, 1864, at the Lincoln General Hospital in Washington, D.C., from an inflammation of the lungs. So you find those type of records in the final statements. We also have carded medical records for regular Army soldiers, identical in nature to what we've seen for the volunteers, but we have a separate series for the regular Army in entry 529, and then a series for the Pioneer Corps, and also a separate series for hospital stewards, non-commissioned officers, and musicians. But again, they're virtually identical to the ones that we've seen for the volunteer soldiers. And we also do have regimental descriptive books for the regular Army, arranged by type of service, arm of service, for artillery, cavalry, infantry, engineers, and other specialized units. But these are not located in Record Group 91 or 94. These are in Record Group 391, which are the records of U.S. Army mobile units, but they do include all of the regular Army regiments that were raised and served during the Civil War. I haven't mentioned descriptive books for the Confederate Army, mainly because we have very, very few that have survived. So that it really wasn't worth mentioning them too much, but you may find one or two for a specific regiment for the Confederates, but there are by far and large not nearly as prevalent as what we have for the Union Army. But they are listed, if you do want to see what we do have, they are listed in the finding aid for RG 109. If you look at go to a particular state, you can see for the regiments that were raised for that state, they might show up a descriptive book or an order book for one or two particular regiments, but you'll find them listed there. We do have a couple of published sources for officers during the Civil War. For whatever reason, officers seem to get more attention than the enlisted men do. All of these different publications you can go to get specific information about officers in the regular Army who served during the war. And we have all these publications over here in our library. But they should be available in most university libraries or public libraries as well. So this is another specific source that you can go to get basic information about officers. And then for the Confederates, they did have their version of the regular Army as well. Units raised directly by the Confederate government. But the difference here is that we do have compiled service records for these regular Army units, as opposed to what we have for the Union Army. And that's generally because when the War Department was creating the Confederate service records, they just went ahead and created the compiled records for whatever type of soldier they found, whether it was from a state regiment or from one of these regiments that were units that are listed here. So we have compiled service records for U.S. or CS regiments, Native American regiments that were raised. They also had their own version of the Invalid Corps you see down here. But basically, as I said, regiments that are raised directly by the Confederate government. So we have all these different types available. We also have a series of compiled service records for Confederate generals and staff officers and non-regimental enlisted men. And this is where I thought your question might come in. You said your ancestor was a courier for General Lee. Well, if, then it's possible you might find him here. As I said, this includes staff officers, not only general officers, but it goes down to the Army Corps Division and Brigade staffs, so, and aides de camp. So if he was a courier, he might fall under the aides de camp category. So that might be worth looking at to see if you might find something on him. But these are all microfilmed, similar to the other state compiled records for Confederate soldiers in M331. And we also have a separate index in M818. And these cover the both the regiment, the organizations raised directly by the regiment, and the general and staff officers. And then I thought there was another one. Oh, I guess not. So this covers all of the compiled service records that we have that would generally relate to what would be regarded as the Confederate regular army. Okay, and that is your basic overview of, in a little more detailed sense, of what we have available for general service in the Union and Confederate armies. And again, this probably doesn't even scratch the surface of what we have, because of course we have pension records for Union soldiers. I mentioned at the beginning that we have hospital records, field hospital records, regimental hospital records during the war. We have prisoner of war records for both Union prison camps and Confederate prison camps. So there's a slew of records that you can still use to document or to research service during the war in the Army. But the records that we cover here should at least get you started. Any questions? Yes, sir.
What about Union draftees in 1863? Are they part of the regular Army collection?
No, the draft records that we have for the Union Army are in record group 110, which are the records of the Provost Marshal's office. But we do have the general, general or consolidated draft lists. Those should still be here in this building, but all of the other field office records that were created during the draft have been sent out to our regional archives, so they've been dispersed.
They're somewhere in the computers.
Yeah, we have them, but they're at the regions. But the consolidated lists should still be here in this building. Was there another question?
Well, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, where would one find information about someone who was a contract doctor working for the Army at a Western fort?
Well,
I know
is that during the
the
war?
person got, no, later after the Civil War, I know the person apparently got a pension, a small pension, because of
Okay.
some illness contracted.
I'm not sure what the date range is, but I know in RG 94 we have a series relating to contract surgeons.
Ah, okay,
We do have that, but I'm not sure if it extends beyond the Civil War or not.
okay. Would you be able to tell from any of the records that are online summarizing the record groups what the date range is on those?
I'm not sure online. I'd probably go to the finding aid and the finding aid for RG 94 is preliminary inventory 17. So if you ever go over to our finding aids office, just ask for PI 17. And that'll give you a listing of all the series in RG 94 and with a pretty good description of each individual series, what it has. You had a question?
I was looking for someone in the First Kansas colored volunteers, but I don't see it under the colored troops.
I know some of the state colored troops were redesignated as USCT, so you probably have to figure out.
I think I have seen something like that when it was 18 or something. So
Well,
maybe
the 18th U.S. colored troops, is that what you're referring to?
I don't know.
It's possible. I'm not sure how you would go about finding it out. But we should have something. Probably if you asked one of the reference archivists over in the Fighting Age room, they should be able to figure it out. What USCT units correlate to former state troops. Another question?
Well, I was just gonna say that I think you probably maybe agree that the biggest problem with doing Civil War research is you've got records spread all over the country. State libraries, private collections, and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
The archives didn't get its hands on everything, obviously, when it was created.
Well, no, basically what we have are the records that the government created during the war. Yeah, so I know there are state archives have their own records, their own enlistment books and things like that. Those also exist, but those aren't federal records. So
Right.
yeah. Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
I was just curious why South Carolina didn't have any records.
For Union? Oh, I thought that would be pretty obvious.
I mean, it's pretty obvious. Or,
Yeah, South Carolina. Those were the hotheads there.
Right.
Yep.
I was curious if that was the reason, or they burned
Pretty
it
much,
or
yeah.
whatever.
Actually,
Yeah.
there were some Union counties up in the north part of, you throw Union County up in the northwest part of South Carolina.
And the Union Army didn't. The Union Army didn't finally get into South Carolina until the very end of the war. So there probably wasn't a whole lot of time left to do any recruiting. Any other questions or comments? Yes, ma'am.
In some of the service records going on now and stuff like this, people can enlist and that helps them get their naturalization. Was there something along that line in the Civil War?
Yes.
The
Yes.
reason I'm asking, my
Mm-hmm.
great-great-grandfather supposedly was born in France,
Mm-hmm.
and he was discharged from, I think, the Union Army in 1863.
Mm-hmm. Yes. During the Civil War, you could expedite your naturalization process by joining the Army. But those records, they wouldn't have been military records. He still would have had to go through the naturalization process in a court. It just would have